Odin and Frigg sat on Hlidskjalf, looking over the worlds and arguing about the last agreement in the council, where Heimdall was to be sent to Midgard thereafter to create the classes of men. But Odin wanted to do this himself, for he was keen to endow numerous people with possession and power. Frigg did not grant her husband the journey to Midgard, for she thought it would bring him pleasure and joy. Perhaps Odin succeeded in dispelling Frigg's fears through skillful speech, and he went among the people under the name Heimdall, or perhaps it was Heimdall himself. And so the Asgardian set off for Midgard, wandered along grassy paths, and came to the shore of a lake, to a farm that consisted of a few huts. Heimdall stepped through the open door of the dwelling into a stone-enclosed fireplace. There, wood was burning. Around this sat I and Edda, great-grandfather and great-grandmother, who had no children yet. Heimdall was asked for his name, and called himself Rig. Then the two elders moved apart, and he sat down between them on the bench. Edda handed him coarse bread, and the grain husks crumbled. There was meat broth in rough clay bowls and other cheese dishes on the table. Soon Heimdall rose, advised Edda to make the bed, and lay down between great-grandfather and great-grandmother. He lived with them for 3 days, then he wandered on. After 9 months, Edda gave birth to a boy. The boy was sprinkled with water, and because he looked earthy, he was called Thrall. His hands were wrinkled, his knuckles gnarled, and his fingers thick. He had a coarse face, a hunched back, and long heels. The thrall grew up, became stronger, and began to bind bast. He eagerly carried brushwood and other loads all day. Then a woman with a bent nose and crooked legs entered the yard. Her arms were sunburned brown, and damp earth clung to her soles, and she was called Maid. The thrall and maid sat on a bench and talked for a long time. Then each went about their work. And in the evening they made the bed, felt comfortable there as well, and then had many children. Some sons were called Coolie, Clumsy, Stinker, Fatty, Lazy Bones, and Braggart. They built fences, tilled fields, bred pigs, tended goats, and dug peat. Some daughters were named Trampler, Thickthigh, Scold, Kitchen Maid, Ragged Lens, and Stony Leg. They founded the class of thralls and maids. After Heimdall had left I and Edda, he walked on broad, well-trodden paths and came to a larger homestead. The guest found the door to the hall in the dwelling house ajar, entered, and called himself Rig. Around the fire that blazed on the floor sat the childless Afe and Amma, grandfather and grandmother. They were not deterred from their work. The grandfather was carving wood for the loom. Heimdall saw that the man's hair was combed into his forehead, and he had neatened his beard. A shirt was stretched across his body. The grandmother sat beside a chest, weaving fabrics for clothes, stretching her arms in hard labor. The woman wore a headdress, a jacket with sleeves, and a scarf around her neck. 2 clasps held it at the shoulders. Heimdall liked the woman's clothing, asked grandmother and grandfather to move apart, and sat down between them on the bench. The grandmother brought soft, freshly baked bread and beer, and then a full bowl of delicious veal. After eating, Heimdall advised the two to go to bed and lay down between grandfather and grandmother. Heimdall stayed with them for 3 days and 3 nights, then set out again. After 9 months, the grandmother gave birth to a child. She sprinkled it with water and named it Karl. The boy's skin was fresh and red, his eyes lively. He grew up and thrived. Karl then built houses, tamed oxen, forged plowshares, steered the plow, and invented the box wagon for transporting loads. Then Karl took a wife with keys on her belt and a skirt made of goatskin. Her name was Schnur, and she wore a veil. The farmer and his wife started a household, felt comfortable in bed as well as by the fire, and had many children. Some sons were named Smith, Braidbeard, Carpenter, Plowman, and Smoothbeard. Some daughters were named Quicktongue, Submissive, Weaver, Spindle, and Proud. From Karl and his wife came the class of the free. This includes farmers, craftsmen, traders, fishermen. Then Heimdall walked on firm, straight paths and came to a large farm. The door to the hall faced south, was protected against wind and weather, and was slid to the side. Heimdall stepped on the straw that covered the compacted floor and called himself Rig. In the hall sat father and mother, playing with their fingers and looking at each other fondly. They did nothing else. The master of the house twisted the bowstring, strung the bow, and carved arrows. The mistress of the house looked pleasingly at her arms, stroked the precious fabric of her garment, and pulled the sleeves tight. Her headgear towered high above her trailing gown. Then Heimdall touched her cheeks, which were brighter, her breast, which was shinier, her neck, which was whiter than pure, freshly fallen snow. Heimdall asked the couple to move apart and sat on the bench between them. The mother laid a white, patterned cloth on the table, placed silver bowls with braised slices of bacon and roasted birds on it, and served thin white wheat bread. Then she brought a jug of mead and poured it into the goblets. After the meal, they continued to chat and talked all day. Then Heimdall advised them to go to bed, and he lay down between father and mother. He stayed 3 nights and felt very comfortable. Then he set off heavy-hearted, and 9 months went by. The mother gave birth to a boy, wrapped him in silk, sprinkled him with water, and named him Jarl. His hair was flaxen yellow, his cheeks shone brightly, and his eyes flashed sharply like those of a young snake. Young Jarl grew up and learned to string the bow and sharpen arrows. He then tamed horses, threw spears, hunted with dogs, and swam across the strait. One day, young Jarl was hunting in the forest. Then Heimdall, disguised as Rig, emerged from a grove and taught him to carve runes, their meaning, and their magic. When Heimdall saw how skillfully young Jarl could handle the runes, he gave him his name and recognized him as his son, and Jarl was now called Rig Jarl and received ample land from Heimdall. Rig Jarl owned 18 farms and was very wealthy. He gave away horses, golden armbands, and distributed other treasures. Through this, he also gained great prestige. Rig Jarl sent companions to the hall of the mighty Herzen to woo his daughter Erna. The girl was very clever and graceful. Her hands were slender, and her skin shimmered white like the feathers of young geese. The messengers won the daughter and led her home to Jarl. Rig Jarl and Erna lived together, took pleasure in each other, and had numerous children. The eldest was called Son. Others were named heir, descendant, offspring. The youngest was called Young King. Jarl's sons grew up, sharpening arrows, shaping shields, taming untamed horses, and throwing oak wood spears. Heimdall taught Young King runes, even those whose magical power lasts forever. Young King now had the power to promote human birth, blunt swords and arrows, and calm the storm. And he learned to understand the sounds of the birds, quench raging fires, soothe angered minds, and ease worries. He gained the strength and power of 8 men. Young King competed with Rig Jarl in rune knowledge and won through greater wisdom and cunning. He was then permitted to be called Rig, and he was known as rune-skilled. Once, Young King rode through the forest, hunting with bow and arrow and luring birds with bait. Then a crow called from a branch, "Why, Young King? Are you pursuing birds? You should rather saddle horses and lead warriors. In the land beyond the sound, there's a king who thinks himself mightier." "What are you cawing, crow?" Into the silence, Young King replied, chasing away her finches. "I'd rather catch the strongest deer than the strongest king." In those early times, there were still such kings.